Welcome back to Tea with Jules. This is part 2 of Rabia Siddique's story.
And I believe that's why, fast forward many months into my tour, I then became involved in a situation that would change my life forever after that. And that would become one of the most pivotal events that happened in the Iraq campaign that was reported all over the world that I didn't realise until much, much later would have profound impact.
What was that?
So it was called the Jamiat incident. So if you can picture, I'd been in Iraq since the beginning of 2005. Second half of that tour in that year, the environment became quite volatile and dangerous. So the Red Cross had pulled out, the UN had pulled out, and so I had been asked to perform another role, a third role, which was to basically be the human rights inspector in the south of the country. And one of these places was a place called Jamiat, which was officially the largest Iraqi police service headquarters. Unofficially, it was also the headquarters of an Iranian-backed terrorist group who had infiltrated the police and who were essentially running the country. And I knew at any one time up to 300 innocent Iraqis were being held there, were being tortured, and many of them never seen again. I also knew that the country was being run by these terrorist police officers, that they were responsible for thousands of kidnappings, tortures, murders of innocents, and all of the explosive attacks that were killing our military personnel. So on the 19th of September, when I arrived at my headquarters really early in the morning in Basra in the south of the country, our headquarters received a message that 2 of my colleagues, 2 British Special Forces soldiers, had been illegally kidnapped by this terrorist group and taken to Jamiat. And I was concerned because of everything I knew about the place, but what could I do about it, right? I'm just the army lawyer. I have no place in this situation. This is not my area of expertise, nor my area of training. So I sit back and I listen to what's unfolding with concern because I know these guys.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, a friend who was the same rank as me, his name's James, he's a career soldier. This is his area. He is ordered in by our commander to go into Jamiat immediately with a group of our colleagues, soldiers, to provide security for him and to see if he can somehow get our guys out, negotiate their release or sneak them out. So off James goes. About 45 minutes, an hour later, we hear from him that the Iraqis had done something very similar. The Iraqi government had sent in their representative to find out what was going on, an Iraqi judge. And as soon as the Iraqi judge arrived and saw James there, he said to him, "Who are you?" And James explained, "I'm from the British Army, you're holding our guys and this is illegal under international law and treaty, and you must release them to me." And he basically said, I don't know who you are, I don't trust you, I will not entertain any discussions with you. And James said to him, "Well, who will you speak to? Who can I bring in here that you will have a conversation with?" And he said, "You send in the only one of you that I trust, that respects us, that has given us any service after asking us what we need." James's message back to us is, "The judge is calling for Major Rabia," which is what they call me. So within a couple of minutes, our commander comes into my office and he orders me in to go into Jamiat, which is about a 15-20 minute helicopter ride away from our base, and to take over from James and to lead what we now understood to be hostage negotiations.
Wow.
And I'm petrified.
Of course.
Because I'm not a trained hostage negotiator. You know, my skills come from my brain and my pen and my mouth, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the words that I use to advocate for others. This is not my area of expertise. And I am quite literally shaking in my boots. And Jules, talk about inspired words in moments of great need. As I am shaking and as I am literally cold with fear, out of nowhere, my dad's words pop into my head. I've already told you he was a wise man and still is. And he used to say to Adam and I as we were growing up, he would say, "Kids, there will be times in your life where you will be called upon to step outside of your comfort zone and to step up and do the uncomfortable for the greater good. And the decision you make in those moments will define your character." And you know, when you're a young adult and those words have no meaning for you, it's like, yeah.
Annoying.
I think that, the equivalent now for teenagers is whatevs, right? So I remember giving my poor dear dad the whatevs. But suddenly those words had resonance because I knew Dad was talking about a moment like this.
Wow, that's huge.
So what are you going to do? There's no choice. There is no choice because, like it or not, the reality is the lives of these men now rest on my shoulders, training or no training. So I have to step up. There is no other option. And so
I'm sweating, by the way, just thinking about this.
Okay. So we need scotch, not tea. Is that what you're saying?
I'm so nervous. And I know how it ends.
I'm going to take a sip.
Oh my gosh.
So I jump on the back of the helicopter and the helicopter sends me in. And as we're hovering over the compound, I see a sight that I'm not used to and I'm not prepared for. Because what had happened was the terrorists were really clever and they had leaked a story out into the community that they had captured and were holding Israeli spies because they knew that that would have a dramatic impact. When I arrived, there was probably about 200 or 300 locals that had come and surrounded the compound believing that there were Israeli spies in. And they were screaming for blood. They were angry. About 100 or so British soldiers, my colleagues, were sent to try and keep them calm to stop a riot situation from brewing. So we land and somehow I managed to jostle my way through this angry crowd, many of whom have got rifles in their hands. And we go to the gate where James is waiting for me. And all the colour had drained from his face. This was a brave man, and he was looking grey. And he managed a bit of a smile, and he takes me into this makeshift office where the judge is sitting down waiting for me. So after probably about 15 minutes of quick talking and negotiating, the judge eventually reluctantly allows James to stay, but the condition is he must not say a word. So now it's him and I. Within about half an hour, 45 minutes, I eventually secure his agreement to take me to the cell where our two guys are being held. And the doors opened and we're kind of almost pushed in, and in the corner are our two guys. And they're bloodied and they're bashed, but they're alive. And I know that they're alive because their chests are going in and out, they're breathing. But they have hoods over their head and their hands and their feet are chained. So as soon as I see that, my blood's boiling because that's against all the international conventions. And I ask immediately for the chains to be removed and the hoods to be taken off. So that's what's done. And I'll never forget, the hoods were taken off these two guys. And they look up at me and they look at each other and they look up at me again. And they kind of manage this uncomfortable smile. And I knew exactly what they were thinking. They were thinking, holy crap, is this the best the British Army can do for us? You know, us two elite killing machines. And I kind of looked at them and shrugged and smiled as if to say, sorry guys, yeah, I'm it. So the judge and I then start up our conversation again. And by this stage, our interpreter has completely freaked out and he's had a meltdown, which is completely understandable, and he's fled the scene. So I have no interpreter. And my Arabic is basic. So I am now trying to negotiate for the lives of my two colleagues with my very, very pidgin Arabic, hoping that I'm not saying the wrong thing. So the judge and I agree a process, and that is that he requires me to do certain actions that I write down on a piece of paper, and as we come to an agreement for each of these actions, he then will release the men into my custody. So it becomes almost like a release contract, and it's up to me to meet all of these conditions. So we draft this, and just as we have agreed the final action that I will take, and we're about to sign the contract, everything goes crazy outside. Rocket-propelled grenades going off in every direction. These blood-curdling cries and screams, and the flames were so ferocious and uncontrollable that I could actually, despite the fact we were in a double stone cell, I could feel the heat coming off these flames. What I didn't realise until much later was the flames were the flames of my friends and colleagues outside on fire. Because what had happened while we were inside was the crowd had grown to almost 3,000, and they were now storming the compound, having set fire to the soldiers that had been sent to try and keep them under control. I hear what sounds like a herd of 1,000 elephants as the crowd break down the final wall, and they're now racing into the compound. And in that moment, everything changes, and our two soldiers are thrown back into the corner. The police that are all standing around now reveal themselves to be the terrorists that they truly are, and they all cock their weapons, their rifles, and they point them at the two guys and they point them at us. The two soldiers, their hoods and their chains were replaced. The judge, looking at what was going on, turned to me and he said to me, Major Rabia, you and I, we are no longer in control. And I'll never forget, he grabbed his papers and he put them in his briefcase and he turned to me and just bowed his head and he turned around and he ran away and I never saw him again. Within seconds of that happening, James and I were grabbed by the scruff of our necks and we were thrown out of the cell and we were thrown into a secondary cell. And within 20 or 30 minutes, 4 guys are then thrown into the cell with us, SAS soldiers that had heard what was happening and they had tried to sneak their way into the compound to try and rescue us, but they were caught and they were thrown in with us. So in this secondary cell, there's now six of us. And I'm the only woman, I'm the only Arabic speaker, and I'm the only one of Muslim heritage, all of which up until that point had been advantageous for me in my role, had served me well in the work that I was doing. But now in this cell, at the hands of our terrorist captors, I become the prime target. I become the traitor and the whore, as they called me. And for the next 8.5 hours, we're held. And in front of my male colleagues, I'm degraded, I'm humiliated, I'm tortured. But miraculously, after 8.5 hours, we're rescued. The tanks, the British and American tanks, come for us. And it was a miracle because when the tanks came for us and I was put into a tank, I realised for the first time that our 2 original guys, while we were being held, they were taken elsewhere to a completely different location. And so when we then went for them and got to them, it was in the nick of time because they were just about to be beheaded. So it was a miracle. It was a miracle that we all survived. If I was talking to you about this being a Hollywood film, this would kind of be when you'd think the credits would roll. Because Hollywood loves a triumphant ending where the good guys survive and fly off into the sunset. What should have probably been the most traumatic experience of my life became the beginning of what would later be the biggest battle.
I'm shook. I'm pretty shook right now.
You okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right.
I mean, it happened to you.
I know, but I've done the work.
You've done the
work. I'm healed and
yeah.
I've made beautiful sense of it all.
It's amazing. It's just unbelievable. What I was trying to sort of figure out in my mind just then, there's a sense of irony about it because you go into battle for justice for yourself.
What happens next?
Yeah.
Ironically, yeah. So 20 years of seeking justice for others, and then I find myself on the receiving end of a great injustice. And so for the first time, I'm called upon to advocate for myself. So what happens, essentially, cutting a very long story short, I return to my headquarters with everybody else. All the men get a hero's welcome, and they are all sent in for what we call debriefing. You and I would call it trauma counselling. Standard procedure when you've gone through something like that. So all of them get, a lot of handshakes and back slaps and roars of cheers, and they go off for support. I'm asked to hang back, and then eventually I'm ushered in to our headquarters after all the men had gone, and I'm greeted by my commander with a cup of tea, and he gives me a peck on the cheek, which he'd never done before, and he does this in front of all of our staff, many of whom reported to me. And then he says to me, Siddique, you must be awfully tired. Run along back to your tent. Don't hurry in tomorrow. So no acknowledgement, no recognition of the role that I'd been asked to play or what I had been through that day. And he knew. He'd been briefed. He knew what I had gone through. And no counselling. And the silence in relation to my existence in the days and the weeks to come was deafening. And I could not understand what was going on. I was so confused. What had I done wrong that I now didn't exist? And those feelings of confusion eventually, as you can imagine, gave way to feelings of betrayal and abandonment. But I had to push them to one side because I was still in Iraq and I had a job to do. And I was there to serve people that were going through far, far greater things than me. So as we say in Australia, I sucked it up. And I continued on till the end of 2005, hoping that I had done some good and helped in some way. At the end of that year, I eventually returned to the UK, which was now home, broken. I was a shadow of my former self, and I didn't realise how broken until much, much later, because 2006 would end up being the worst year of my life. My then husband and I decided that we wanted to start a family, and we were very fortunate. I got pregnant very quickly, but at the 4-month point, in an emergency diagnosis, I was diagnosed with a very rare form of ectopic pregnancy, which almost saw me off. And one day I was sitting on the end of my hospital bed, and my then husband brought in an official looking envelope that had 2 pieces of paper. And I opened the envelope and I took out the first piece of paper and I read it, and it was a newspaper clipping from a famous London newspaper. And it was where I learnt for the first time that James, do you remember James? That he had been awarded a military cross by the Queen for his bravery in the event. And I was so happy and so proud of him. And I excitedly opened this second piece of paper and I read it, and I read it again, and I read it for a third time because it took 3 readings for me to understand what it was. And it was a written order from the highest commanders in the army ordering me never to speak of my involvement and the role that I had played in the Jamiat affair. It was what we called a gag order. And when I read it for this third time, I had an involuntary flashback. I had an involuntary flashback to 20 years earlier, because I knew that this was the second time in my life that I was being told to never speak of the injustice that I was suffering. But of course, a lot had changed, because not only was I 20 years older, I was now educated, I was articulate, I had a voice. I dedicated my life to justice and truth for others. And so I knew this to be wrong, and I knew I now had to do something about it. This was not something that I should or could be silenced about. But 2006 wasn't quite finished with us, because 3 weeks after I eventually recovered and returned to service, my then husband was diagnosed with cancer. And the prognosis wasn't good. He was given a 20% chance of surviving. And as we were struggling with that, the nail in the coffin, I got a call from a dear friend of mine who was still in Iraq. And he had called to tell me that my closest Iraqi colleague and friend, a man by the name of Asaf was a judge's associate. He was the husband to an incredibly beautiful and intelligent woman, and the dad of 2 gorgeous kids who were under 4 when I met them. The call was to tell me that Asaf had been executed. He'd been murdered. This is where it gets tough for me. And I knew as soon as I got that call that I was responsible for his death, because the year before I had convinced Asaf to work with me and work alongside me in exposing the human rights abuses in his country. And you talk about brave, so courageously, when I returned to the UK, he continued with this work on his own, which of course made him a prime target for the terrorists. And so one day, as he was carrying out his work selflessly, he was shot twice in the back of the head. And when I got this call, all I could think about, the whole world went black for me. And all I could see was his blood on my hands. And all I could think about was that I had robbed his 2 babies, these 2 beautiful babies that I knew, of their daddy. It was my fault. And in that moment, I didn't want to live another second. Because all around me, all I saw was darkness and chaos and injustice and misery. And I don't quite remember exactly what happened next, but I must have fallen to my knees, because my next recollection is my then husband picking me up. We've all had those times in our life where we've been on our knees. And I guess for me, the biggest learning is that I'm still here today. You have to reflect on who and what are those things that got you through, because they are your lifeline. And they're your reason for being. And they're the things that you must honour going forward in the world, right? If that makes sense. And despite what he was going through, that was my husband for me at the time. And he picked me up and he held my hand and he said, "My darling, you're broken and you need help." So I got help, and I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. No surprises, there's a shocker. And thanks to some amazing medical and health professionals who gave me that gift, because now the demon had a name, if that makes sense. And now I could confront the demon and do the work to overcome it so that I could heal. And so that's what I did. And so now, healed and stronger than ever, I was ready to right this wrong. And so for the next 2 years, I exhausted every avenue I knew of to try and address this injustice. And at every turn, I came up against closed door after closed door. And there was only one avenue left available to me, to get justice, and that would be an extreme path to take, and I knew it would mean the end of my career, my military career at least, but I knew I had to take this path because I knew that if I didn't, I couldn't live with myself. And I knew that if I didn't, it would make, for me at least, everything that I had committed my life to seem like a hypocrisy. And I could never ask another soul to share their story bravely if I wasn't prepared to. And so that was to basically mount a discrimination case against the British military, which meant suing the British government. And the next 18 months of my life would be hell. The government and the military tried every trick in the book to intimidate me and terrorise me into dropping the case. But many, many times in history, many white men in power underestimate the resolve of strong women. And all it served to do was to make me realise that I had to keep going, because I'd already been to hell and back a number of times. So there was nothing more this institution could do to me. And I won my case. And I didn't think for a second until after the case that this was actually a landmark case. And after I won, it was reported all around the world, and I received thousands of messages from people across the globe who had read about it. And the messages were the same. We've read about your story, and as you, as one person, an outsider, a woman, someone of Muslim heritage, could take on the might of a government and get change and get justice, then you have made us realise that we must take a stand and we must be the change in our lives, in our organisations and in our institutions. And there were some of the messages I read were heartbreaking stories of people that had been victimised and bullied and terrorised over who they were, how they'd chosen to live their lives. They'd bravely decided to call out terrible behaviour and conduct around them. And I guess for me, that's when it truly dawned on me my biggest life lesson, which is the power of the one and the power that we all have to create ripples of change. And I truly believe in that. And I think for me, the biggest lesson through that whole journey for me was that we all, if we choose to embrace it, have this capacity to create ripples of change. And what do we know about ripples? They always grow into waves. That's an undeniable law of physics. And we all have a sphere of influence, whether it be just in our homes or in our communities. You don't have to have wealth. You don't have to have great intellect. You don't have to have profile. We all have a sphere of influence. And we can channel that and we can use that to create change. And that for me has been my biggest life lesson. So after I won my case, obviously, that was the end of army life, because one doesn't sue the British government and expect for one's career to remain intact, right? But I'm very fortunate because I get the opportunity for the next few years to serve as a war crimes and terrorism prosecutor. So what I am exposed to then post 9/11, and that I was privileged, blessed to be someone in a position to be able to do that. So by now, I'm also given a wonderful gift, because after the cancer, after my ectopic pregnancy, we didn't think that children were on the cards for us. Miraculously, my ex-husband beat all the odds and survived. And we went down the IVF route, and we were blessed with a gift 3 times over. So we became parents of triplet boys. So as you know, Jules, when you become a parent, life changes profoundly and you look at the world in a completely different way.
As if you haven't done enough already, bringing 3 children at the same time into the planet. I mean, that alone deserves a tea with Josh moment. Just
Thank you.
Part of it.
Well, everything else was training for that, right? Terrorists, Iraq, the army, never mind all of that. That was just training ground for growing, birthing and raising triplets.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they were my gift 3 times over for everything that came before. This was the balancing of my scales. So this was the universe saying to me, here is your gift, and here is now your reason for being, and the new centre of your world.
Yeah.
So that and the case changed everything, because I realised now that it wasn't just about me being on a mission to help others This was now me feeling something softer but equally as stronger, which was this responsibility to do what I could to raise awareness, to inspire and empower others to do the same in their own way through their stories and using their influence to essentially, and it sounds cheesy, but I know no other way of saying it, to essentially make our world a better place.
Your story is, as I said in the beginning, incredible, and you tell it so beautifully, and I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate you telling your story.
That's gracious of you. Thank you.